all of you here in the room and to those who are joining us today online. I'm Julianne Schober and I direct the Asia Center, and I want to introduce our team. Professor Rel Hedberg is the Associate Director of the Center, and Chan Nguyen is the Senior Coordinator, who will also be helping us with the questions that those of you online might want to type into the chat box after the talk for the discussion part of this conversation. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce you today to Professor Nick Cheesman from Australian National University, where he is Associate Professor in the Department of Political and Social Change and Director of the Myanmar Research Center. Professor Cheesman describes himself as a student of law and politics, researching torture in Myanmar and Thailand with a focus on state violence and the rule of law, empirical political theory, and the making of social scientific knowledge. He was fellow at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies and is currently at the Baldy Center for Law and Social Politics at State University of New York, Buffalo. And among other fellowships, he has held one with the American Bar Foundation in Chicago. He won the Distinguished Book Award of the Asian Law and Society Association for his monograph entitled Opposing the Rule of Law, How Myanmar's Courts Make Law and Order. And he published many edited volumes and articles and book chapters in his celebrated career. Among them are Interpreting Communal Violence in Myanmar, published by Routledge, and with Nick Farrelly, Conflict in Myanmar, War, Politics, and Religion. And then there is also the Debating Democratization in Myanmar. Last year, he published an article entitled Revolution in Myanmar in the Arena Quarterly. And today, he will provide us with an extended consideration of revolution and the lived forms it takes in Myanmar and elsewhere. His talk is entitled Myanmar's Revolutionary Situation and Political Theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nick Cheesman.
I'd like to start by thanking Professor Julianne Schober for that tremendously generous and flattering introduction, and thank everyone at the Center for inviting me to come here today to be present with you at Arizona State. And also thank you, Chan Nguyen, for the tremendous assistance that you've provided to make this event happen and allow me to come here. And now that I am here, I'd also like to acknowledge and celebrate as a visitor to ASU, the sovereign nations on whose lands we meet, to thank them for their care and keeping of the country, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. At the outset, I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to all of those Myanmar nationals who have opted to resist renewed military dictatorship in whatever form it's taken, and in particular to express my solidarity with friends and colleagues in Myanmar universities who have walked the path of civil disobedience. David Easton once wrote that it is an axiom of political theory that political ideas flourish in the soil of social conflict and change. If this holds true, as he says that it does, then Myanmar should be among the most fecund sites for political theoretic inquiry in the world today. Even more, given the renewed interest in what Judith Butler has referred to as the form and effect of public assemblies following the Arab uprisings, Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, and now the protests in Iran, to name a few. Since February 2021, when the country's military again seized government through a coup, Myanmar has been in the grip first of sustained acephalous protests that ran up and down the length of the country, and then what has become a protracted revolutionary situation. A situation in which there are plausible, competing, exclusive claims to sovereign power, in which state authority comes under severe assault but does not collapse. This is a different situation from the one that predated the coup, in which many armed groups exercised more or less plausible claims to sovereign power over subnational territories and those people, other sentient beings and things in them. Now the claims are national. It's not only the future of Rakhine State or Kachin State or Wa State that is at stake, but today the conflict in Myanmar has gone on to the whole of its territory, all of the beings and things that are in it. Because the stakes in Myanmar are then, and I think this is befitting of the rubric for this Global Asia series, globally significant, and because hugely important contributions to political thought have come from periods of turmoil and conflict, the question that prompts my lecture today is, what can political theory contribute to understanding of this situation that might help to define it and clarify the grounds for political action? Today, I'm going to offer what's really a very provisional response to this question in three parts. First, to make my case for political theory, I'll begin with an outline of Myanmar's revolutionary situation since the coup, concentrating on how people expressed their political claims, how those claims were met, and what happened next. Secondly, I'm going to track back to the 1990s and 2000s to explore the relation between sovereign power and citizenship in Myanmar, to consider how public order and political order there is today being altered irrevocably by virtue of the country being in a revolutionary situation. Here, my argument is that in Myanmar today, sovereign power is being plausibly contested by people enacting citizenship. Though descriptively speaking, there is obviously conflict for control of sovereign power in Myanmar, it's not only that sovereign power is being contested in fact, but the idea of sovereign power itself is at stake, and with it, the category of the citizen. Because of the way sovereign power is being contested, the citizen is, whether intentionally or inadvertently, being brokered. Citizens in Myanmar today are, in a fashion, fashioning themselves. Thirdly and finally, I'll close by articulating three reasons that I think political theory can help by clarifying, recording, and rearranging meanings of sovereignty and citizenship, by illuminating, provoking, and exciting thought about why this revolution matters, and by pushing against despondency and remaining hopeful. Political theory, by inviting us to look for openings when we might not otherwise find them, and encouraging us to take imaginative leaps into worlds that are not quite those that we inhabit, does a different sort of work, I think, from other parts of the political and social sciences, a sort of work that I think matters for all of us who care about what is happening in Myanmar today and care for our colleagues and friends who are enjoined in struggle against dictatorship. So I begin by returning briefly to the enormous protests that enveloped Yangon, Mandalay, provincial towns and cities up and down the country in February, March, and April of 2021. They began, as I think many of you will recall, in a festival atmosphere with choruses of demands for the immediate release of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, along with hundreds, then thousands of other political prisoners from her National League for Democracy, from other political parties, as well as from state agencies and their affiliates. I must mention here that among them, my colleague from the Australian Academy, the economist Sean Turnell, remains in the central jail, having been convicted under the Official Secrets Act. The assembled demonstrators quickly began to challenge ideas about political order in Myanmar that in the 3/4 of a century since the country pulled free from the decrepit British Empire have never been settled. Even before the arbitrary killing, extralethal violence, abduction, and torture that comprised the military's response to the protests escalated, demands for the recall of the semi-elected legislature was supplemented and then supplanted by demands for the overthrow of the military state itself. As soldiers, paramilitary police, and their proxies systematically shot, assaulted, and publicly degraded demonstrators, those who yet took to the streets inverted the relationship between them and their adversaries, pronouncing soldiers and paramilitary cops that they encountered not to be the guardians of sovereign power that they're made out to be, and this is a point I'll return to shortly, but robbers of it. They did this, among other things, in chants that went like, "Sit the bomya, pyocha ye, do ye." Our aim, overthrow the military rebels, and slogans like, "Ana lu, sit asoya alumshi," down with usurper military dictatorship, and as you'd expect, a Yedobon Ongyame, victory to the revolution. These and countless other aphorisms, poems, jeers, and songs in the months after the coup were, to be sure, intermingled with a good amount of profanity to express popular contempt for General Min Aung Hlaing and his running dogs, Sitkwe. One of the most common expressions of contempt is descriptively very simple. In the abbreviation of General Min Aung Hlaing's name to its initials, Ma'ala, there is then a spoonerism for motherfucker, Ma'ilo, one accompanied by countless portraits of Ma'ala being trampled underfoot, being draped with women's lower garments, and sometimes rubbed with people's genitalia. But rather than dwelling on these profanities or other vernacular expressions of contempt, I emphasize references to military rebels, usurper dictators, and revolutionary victory, because my goal here is not to invite a sociolinguistic or a semiotic analysis of revolution, interesting and important though that would be, sure enough, but to identify, broadly speaking, the characteristics of the situation in Myanmar that make it revolutionary and deserving of political theoretic attention. Those are characteristics that express through words and assembled bodies how newly emergent collectivities are making plausible exclusive claims to sovereign power against those of the military state. So let me start with words and how they brought the revolutionary situation, as it were, into being. Claims on sovereign power were loudly and unambiguously made and heard in the days, weeks, and months after the coup, in, among other things, strategic inversions of the usurper military's language of terrorism, such as the junta's denotation of itself as the State Administrative Council, which protesters denounced as the terrorist military council, Jampet Sit Council, an appellation that puts all of those who embarked on armed violence against the junta, not in the category of terrorists, as the military would have them, but counter-terrorists. Others revolting against the usurper military rhetorically demoted the military itself from its erstwhile status as Ratmador, a pompous self-appellation for defense services that invokes the sovereign power of ancient kingdoms, to the Bom Sikdat rebel army, a usage that once more inverts the relation between the demonstrators and soldiers and underscores that this is not a commissary dictatorship or a temporary executive of the sort that back in 1958 opens the way for usurpers to come, but an armed force that opposes and destroys the sovereign power that it purports to defend. Similarly, we heard revolutionary claims in the weighty denunciation Pasis Sitdat, fascist army, a usage that does not allude to fascism as an ideal type, but to the historically specific experience of fascism in Burma during the Second World War, the fascism of historical myth-making, perhaps, against which people were united in struggle. That's to say, fascist army does not so much register qualities of the army itself as it does its opponents. Fascist here is a negative descriptor, a placeholder. Anti-fascist, the term that is implied by it, its productive opponent, which places this historically significant struggle in a lineage of revolutionary action, to which revolutionaries today can refer and from which they can draw as they organize, innovate, form alliances, and make their claims. If the strategic rhetoric and semantic inversions of people in Myanmar have given the revolutionary situation its voice, then we have at the same time seen those claims made plausible and effective in the sheer numbers of bodies on the streets until they could no longer bear the weight of gunfire and systematic performed atrocity. The public coming together in the days, weeks, and months after the coup was not a passing act of resistance, I do not think, but an embodied form of popular sovereign power, a demand for recognition and a refusal of the military for its failure to give that recognition, which echoes through Myanmar's revolutionary situation today. This demand was elaborated in the months after the coup by people from all parts of the country's public service who committed themselves to civil disobedience and formed associations to articulate their refusals. Among them, interim revolutionary university councils that published charters variously declaring a general strike against education for enslavement of the military, Sitjun Binyaye, and announcing that they would act to destroy fascist dictatorship at its roots. The most remarkable embodiment of the refusal, without which the revolutionary situation would not have become so protracted, came when thousands of youths took to the countryside to seek training and arms from established parastates in frontier areas, and thereafter with the mushrooming of hundreds of new People's Defence Forces, many of them in urban areas and parts of the country, Sagaing and Magui regions in particular, that have not experienced revolutionary violence in anyone's living memory. Behind these, in September 2021, came the declaration of a People's Defensive War by the National Unity Government, which had by then formed to stand in for the government of Aung San Suu Kyi. The NUG makes for a fascinating case study in revolution planning and action, not least of all when compared to its ineffectual predecessor, the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma, which formed after an earlier junta denied the results of the 1990 general election, that it denied rather that those results gave the NLD a mandate to govern, as the NLD said that they did. The NCGUB differentiated itself from the military state by producing its own coat of arms. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, it conducted diplomatic work, which was frankly of pretty limited success and little significance. It left military affairs to those armed parastates with which it had relations. It cooperated with groups like the Burma Lawyers Council, which set to work on one or more draft constitutions for a future federation, but it didn't coordinate activities. The NUG, by contrast, acts as government. It represents Myanmar's citizenry by adopting and using the existing state seal and issuing notifications in the manner of government. It has a full suite of ministries that are more or less active. Its education ministry is, among other things, working with those university councils I mentioned a moment ago, which, like the NUG, act as though they are university councils, running online courses, making job announcements, calling for registrations for exams, issuing certificates of completion, and so on. Its Ministry of Justice is setting up courts in parts of Upper Myanmar, and I know with interest that it has this past week announced the establishment of one in Gatha, north of Mandalay, where, by the way, George Orwell was stationed as an imperial police officer. And in starkest contrast to its predecessor, the NUG has a defense ministry and has established its own People's Defense Force, under which it is attempting to draw hundreds of People's Defense Forces, plural, into a command structure. For revenue and finance purposes, the NUG has set up an official cryptocurrency, which I read has reportedly moved over $600,000 into the country within a few months. Now, this is small change compared to what is needed, but that's not, from my point of view, really the point. The point is that this presents a plausible alternative to the country's paper currency, which incidentally has lost a third of its value since the coup. The NUG has issued government bonds, launched an official lottery, sold shares to land and buildings that General Ma'ala has reportedly seized for his own use as well. In a statement last month, it said it had raised about $42 million through these various routes. On the diplomatic front, it has successfully prevented the usurper military from taking the country's seat at the United Nations General Assembly for 2 years running, and set up a number of missions with tacit recognition from host countries, including Australia, France, Japan, Korea, and the UK. Bureaucrats from Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs, MPs, and senators from all of the major parties, by the way, were at the opening of the mission in Canberra in August, despite warnings from the other embassy to them and other people who attended not to go. In sum, the NUG is, far from fading into the background, as the NCGUB did, exercising a plausible, competing, exclusive claim to sovereign power, though its efforts thus far have been well short of sufficient to cause state authority to collapse from underneath the military command's weight. But it's not the plausibility of that claim, or not only that plausibility, that I think makes it interesting and important. It's that while it is a competing claim, it draws its energy from forces that are beyond the NUG's control, who are enacting a form of sovereign power that is not juridical but popular, and in doing that, creating conditions of possibility to renegotiate what it means to be a citizen in Myanmar today. So let me now expand on that last point. In the schema of Myanmar's military, sovereign power, Achokcha Ana, is inert. It has no force of its own. It is a referent object of security, something that must be cared for, critical to the survival of the state, but vulnerable to attack. It stands to reason that it is always in need of guardianship. This is the role that the military then plays. This is the burden that it must bear, defending sovereign power against its enemies. It insists on this role for historical and rhetorically national political reasons. The military needs no external authorization for it to play this role. It is itself the author of it and the exclusive actor. By its own reckoning, it is the only institution both capable and meritorious enough to succeed in doing it. The premise is that without the military playing this role, sovereignty would be lost and the Union of Myanmar, such as it is, would cease to exist. If sovereignty is for Myanmar's military a referent object of security, then the citizen, it follows, is a latent security threat. The citizen is, in this schema, a category on which work must be done, not through which things are done. In fact, what must be done is precisely to prevent things to be done through the citizen, because that's how threats arise. Whereas sovereign power is inert, citizens then must be made inert. Hence the iterative command relation observable in the military practice of political order, which is performed literally every time that an army officer or a proxy addresses a gathering denoted as, usually on a banner behind them, duizongwe, a meeting, in the sense that its participants are seen, duizong, but not heard. With this duizong, there is no dialogue, swingwei, no Q&A, no meeting of minds or exchanging of views. Sovereign power issued as commandment then emphasizes power as ana, a form of power that by virtue of it being possessed is at once self-justificatory and rightfully backed by force. It is, as Gustav Hauptmann observed in his enduringly relevant mental culture in Burmese crisis politics, centralized. Hence the term for a dictator is ana shin, the lord or possessor of ana. Or to think comparatively, as Mona El-Gabashi has put it, of military ideology in Egypt, it expresses a vision of the world without contending interests, absent multiple solutions to pressing problems. In this type of order, the citizen is, and in Myanmar in the 1990s and 2000s was, tasked politically with no more than not doing anything to threaten that power arrangement. Hence the menacing exhortation that was posted on billboards around the country and printed in magazines and newspapers back then: don't let the union disintegrate because of you. This is a form of political and social order, as Charles Tilly eloquently put it, as conceived by the racketeer, quote, someone who creates a threat and then charges for its reduction. That's to say, the army's role so conceived is to guard sovereign power and the citizens to be on guard against threats to it. The army in this setup relates to the citizen not through reciprocally binding obligations of security and care, but out of benevolence and goodwill, the practice of which, by its own lights, affirms the moral superiority of its leadership and the inevitability and dispensability of the military's guardianship role. So that's how things were in Myanmar up to some point in the mid-2000s or early 2010s, depending on who you listen to. Then events took a different turn. We met with the Reform era, what that decade has come to be known as, in any case, as the Reform era. And in that period, the military conception of supremely vulnerable sovereign power under its guardianship met with a re-emergent citizenry. The reformed citizen was no longer obliged to be seen but not heard, provided that their words and actions didn't outright threaten sovereign power. Reformed citizens were entitled, up to a point, to stand up, speak out, and talk back. And so they did, in mass demonstrations over land confiscation, in press conferences, demanding an end to military impunity for abduction, rape, and killing, in public affairs debated in print and platform media. The reformed citizen again became someone to be reckoned with, and citizenship something that might once more be worth fighting for. But for all this, the reformed citizen didn't collide head-on with the army's conception or guardianship of sovereign power. Instead, they were enlisted to help defend against it. And that was by way of defending against people racially classed and scientifically administered as others. The results were, as we all know, disastrous. The reformed citizen was let loose on internal enemies. Mass killing, rape, assault, and torture with impunity of Muslims in 2012 and 2013 forced hundreds of thousands to flee to Bangladesh and augured the 2017 rampage across the Rakhine State, the northern part of Rakhine State, by the army, that itself portended the systematic and exemplary lethal and extra-lethal violence of 2021 that has continued up to the present with, in the last week alone, artillery attacks on villages and an airstrike that reportedly killed over 60 festival goers and performers. Back in the 2010s, attempts by international agencies and outside governments to intervene in the violence became more determined, and in response, the army's appeals to sovereign power more belligerent. Reformed citizens' insistence on their rights, to be clear, not the human rights that the National League for Democracy had once championed, but citizens' rights became more bellicose as well. The reformed citizen, it turned out, wasn't going to be fashioned in a paternalistic liberal image of people governed by the rule of law at all, but it seemed, for a time at least, in a nook of the army's juridical conception of sovereign power. The reformed citizen defended sovereign power by vociferously refusing to negotiate the category of citizenship, and instead by brokering the very idea of what it means to be human. How things have changed. In the crucible of Myanmar's revolutionary situation, the reformed citizen, I think, is no more. Protesters who took to the barricades in 2021 have joined civil disobedience campaigns, People's Defense Forces, and other initiatives to drive the military out of government by performing and articulating a response to sovereign power, not as a supremely sovereign force, which is in need of protection, but as an act of coming together politically. They have in this way contested the sovereign power that the usurper military insists that it alone can care for, and have embodied a different conception of sovereignty, namely popular sovereign power, a form of sovereign power that is realized when citizens make claims that are separate from and not controlled by institutional terms for the demarcation of sovereignty. And let's be clear, that's whether it's coming from the military junta or those of the NUG or any other institutionalized arrangements for that matter. In these conditions, the category of citizen has not only been destabilized, thrown open and renegotiated, but potentially made anew. Put another way, the conditions of possibility now exist for people to make themselves as citizens as they will. The citizen is in this way not someone who is formed after the revolutionary situation, i.e. we have to wait until the revolution is over, see what the outcome is, and then let's determine what type of citizen we have. Therefore, it's not to say something we have to be looking towards, but rather is someone who is created during it. This citizen is not a consequence of the revolutionary situation, but constitutive of it. The category of the citizen, the meaning of citizenship is through the struggle for sovereign power itself thrown into dispute. Dispute, I say, because the citizen still has to be demarcated. And that is not something that can or will ever be done easily. I'm not starry-eyed about this. I may be giving the impression that I am, so let me disabuse you of that idea if you have it. I'm not saying that I think things are going to turn out for the best for Myanmar's revolutionary forces because everyone's going to learn to get along. I'm not saying that everyone who participates in revolutionary struggle has a political consciousness or the kinds of values that I've been alluding to here. Nor am I saying that racism melts away in the heat of a revolutionary situation. To the contrary, as the status of the citizen is fought over, including through the usurper military's revocation of its enemy's citizenship and hardening of its own juridical categories, new lines have to be drawn between who is rightfully a citizen and who is not. But the terms of engagement have undeniably changed, and the revolutionary situation brings with it conditions in which, at least for some people, the unthinkable becomes thinkable, the impossible imaginable. That brings me to my concluding remarks. A little bit of advocacy for political theory in these revolutionary times. Political theory comes bearing neither arms nor funds for revolutionaries. It has no medical skills for urgent needs. It doesn't have any policy solutions for fraught problems. It's not in the nature of political theory to bear these things or to have these things. But there are at least 3 good reasons in these times, I think, to give it its due. The first is revolutionary situations are hard to keep up with. There's always something going on. Political theory can temper and discourage the tendency that we often have to pile up facts one on top of another, as if the accumulation of these will aid our understanding of the situation. As Lisa Wadeen has shown in her work on Syria, the opposite can be the case. Undoubtedly, without facts, it's not possible to interpret events. However, facts, when contradictory and frightening, as they often are in a revolutionary situation, can also disable political action. The accumulation of facts not guided by purpose or informed by theory can be counterproductive. Political theory, by attending to how values are being negotiated and altered through revolutionary words and deeds like those that I've spoken about today, through talk and action, can help people to get their bearings and open ways of thinking and talking that might not otherwise be possible. If that type of work can nevertheless be done without recourse to political theory, such as through policy agendas and statements of purpose or political scientific inquiry that suppresses the part that values and ideas have in animating political practices, then that is why my second reason to advocate for political theory is a necessary supplement to the first. And that is that, as Wendy Brown has put it, theory's most important political offering is that it opens up breathing space between the world of common meanings and its world of alternative ones, without which it wouldn't be possible to imagine another political world at all. In other words, the terms for political theory are not and cannot be set by people in revolutionary situations that nourish and inspire it. Political theory can, and in my view, should learn from what sovereignty means for people in Sagaing or Wa State or Northern Rakhine, but it cannot be beholden to those meanings. This is not the same thing as saying that, as Clifford Geertz memorably put it, the task for political or social analysts is to produce interpretations of how people live that are neither imprisoned in their interlocutors' mental horizons nor deaf to the tonalities of their existence. If for Geertz the problem was how to crisscross the ground on which ethnographic interpretations might stand, then I think for political theory, it's how to find some other ground, how to take an imaginative leap to a place that ground rights does not quite exist, that is not quite the world that we inhabit. It is this distance that political theory has from the descriptive or the empirical, she adds, that is its incomparable value, not its weakness. Theory, she says, does not simply decipher the meanings of the world, but recodes and rearranges them in order to reveal something about the meanings and incoherencies that we must live with. Theory violates the self-representation of things in order to represent those things and their relations differently. Thus, theory is never accurate or wrong. It is only more or less illuminating, more or less provocative, more or less an incitement to thought, imagination, desire, possibilities for renewal. Brown's remarks lead me directly to a third and final reason to advocate for political theory in revolutionary times. That is, against cynical commentators who masquerade as hard-headed realists to conceal their conservative values and justify, indeed to celebrate, their insulting character and their intellectual dishonesty. Political theory is neither an exercise in futility and nor does it invite expressions of futility. The opposite is the case. Political theory is a hopeful enterprise. It's hopeful in part because it has within it, as Hannah Pitkin once wrote, an element of the heroic. Sounds a bit exaggerated, so let's say that granted this is a modest and not obvious heroism, but I think it is an important one. It is, I think, why I've come to appreciate political theory and find it more attractive than many of its alternatives for making sense of what's going on in Myanmar and elsewhere today. This element arises from a knowledge of and a concern for those alternative worlds about which Brown writes, which are not quite ours, but might conceivably be. And that is exactly why Pitkin adds, political theory speaks to polities in crisis like Myanmar today. Though it can change nothing but people's views, it is people's changed views that lead them to want to change the world. Thank you all very much. Wish for me to remain standing, or shall I resume?
As you feel, as you prefer.
Get my water and
Yeah,
else to see if I
please
stay on my feet.
Thank you for a very insightful discussion and description of events in Myanmar. I want to invite everyone in the room. If you have questions you'd like to ask or respond with things to be discussed, please do so, Jim Raj.
Well, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you. My question is, can you tell us something about the intelligentsias that might be active in the NUG circles, among whom these kinds of ideas are being discussed?
Thank you. Great question. Short answer, no. I don't work or have close contact actually with NUG, although it's an opportunity with them setting up an office where my university is to have those types of conversations, and I'm looking forward to them. But really what I was trying to do, and what I'm still interested to do, is think through how precisely that type of thinking and communicating has been going on since the very first days of the revolutionary situation, and how it has then made its way into a variety of different fora, including into the NUG. My sense is, having said that, and here this is really not from observation, but by way of speculation, that there are people in the NUG who are more or less interested in thinking and talking along the lines I've suggested. There are some people who, by virtue of the backgrounds that they've had and the practices of thinking and talking that they're accustomed to, really be embracing of the kinds of ideas that I've been setting out to, and perhaps others who are more concerned with strategic actions, how to get on with things, as it were. But I do think that overall, the NUG project, which any of us can observe, of course, is striking for the reasons I was alluding to, that it does suggest that there are conversations, there are engagement and ways of thinking about the intersection, the nexus, if you like, between thinking politically and acting strategically, right? In other words, for instance, the decision to declare a people's war at a time that there was hardly any evidence that, that this could possibly succeed. It was coming on the back, of course, of the formation of the People's Defense Forces in various parts of the country, but well before any of them consolidated, as some in Sagaing now have, and others, of course, have been utterly destroyed by military responses. So that was a bold and decisive step that suggests again that there was thinking about, well, if we want to stake the kind of claim, which I've been speaking to, a claim on sovereign power, then how do we do that in a way that gets the sort of recognition that it's not going to come to us from the military, but might come from elsewhere? It was a risky move because in the first instance, many of the, say some of the people I was alluding to at the end of the paper responded by saying, well, that means that diplomatically, nobody will deal with it. There is no state that's going to engage with the NUG if it's espousing or advancing armed resistance, right? They're wrong. We now know it, right? For reasons that I was pointing to. Of course, if anyone else in the room has any input on discussions in the NUG or the way that members of that community of thinkers and actors are communicating with one another, I'd be pleased to hear about it. Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is a different question, so if anyone wants to take that thread.
I can speak a little bit about NUG.
Please.
Again, I'm Prof with the Burmese community here in Phoenix, Arizona. Regarding NUG, I do participate in meetings with them. So just for your question there, I think NUG seeks advice from expatriates who are here in the States, also in the States and other countries. We do have regular meetings and we're quite open. I am surprised how openly they are and how much criticism they take at those meetings. And so just a little bit of the answer to you is that they do get advice from many expatriates from Burma.
Is there debate about political ideas in those meetings?
Okay.
Is there debate about political ideas
Yeah,
in those
yes, very
meetings?
much
Of
so.
course,
Especially
federalism
with
is an
the-
example of
With the
one.
young generations and especially I attend with the Ministry of Defense, MOD. They get a lot because of the support, the lack of support from NUG to PDFs and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of criticism, not criticism, but at least they're not as, it's not meeting as what they expect. And like you said, the $42 million that were collected for two different means, despite it being already dispersed for 95% of it, it's not seen out. So that's one of the things that a lot of one of the main criticism or complaints that we often hear at these meetings here.
Yeah, enjoyed the talk. Just had a question about, so your main claim, what I'm getting from the talk is the importance of political theory to understand the conflict in Myanmar. My question is, to whom is this talk intended for, right? So if it's for me, I'm just sympathetic, this is a professor, I've taken theory classes, I've been force-fed theory, so I understand the importance of it. But is this claim you're making, is it for the audience in this room, or is it for people on the ground in Myanmar? Is it for the political leaders in Myanmar? Like, I'm just curious, what is the intended audience of this claim? Just because people in this room, I think, are sympathetic to this argument, because people have to read theory in academia. But outside of it, I'm not sure how that takes place. Are we talking about dropping communist manifestos from the airplanes to like the peasantry? So I'm just curious what who you're making this claim towards.
Thank you. That's a good question about audience. If I was to be perfectly honest, the first audience would be myself, because we all try and persuade ourselves of our ideas by working through them, writing them out, and getting into conversation with colleagues like yourself, right? So in the first instance, it's an exercise for myself to make sense of this possibility. But secondarily, it is really an address to our intellectual communities in the academy, in the Anglophone world, of course, because I'm in a university right now, which is among that academy, in that academy, my own institutions are as well. So I can't presume to address people who are not members of intellectual communities or communities of action in which I have some part in which I can say something meaningful on terms that are sensible both to me and them. One reason I'm saying that, though, is that it's actually surprising how little political theoretic work has been done on, I'll fall back from saying Southeast Asia, I just don't know enough of the literature everywhere, but certainly on Myanmar and even to some extent on mainland Southeast Asia in recent years. And if anyone in the room wants to push back on that, I'd be pleased to hear it. There are works that I think are political theoretic in their qualities, right? So Professor Shoba's work in some ways is, right, precisely because of the category of secularism and the work that it was doing to make sense of the relationship between Buddhism and political order in Myanmar. Matthew Walton, a comparative political theorist, of course, working on Myanmar. Think of Thailand, I think of someone like Patrick Jory and his theory of monarchy. These are examples of colleagues whose work comes to mind. There are others, of course. But what I'm trying to advocate for is that kind of tacking back and forth between observations of what we encounter in political action in Myanmar, rather than, say, a return to, at least in the first instance, a return to history. I think there are important reasons to go back to history, but to go back to history through an inquiry into what is happening right now. And also a reluctance sometimes on my part to turn to sort of doctrinal questions of the sort with which some of Matt Walton's work is taking up, right, where it's sort of the conceptualization of categories out of the Buddhist domain, the Buddhist doctrine, and then how they might conceivably inform political action. That's one way to go about it, and I think it's a very important contribution. But the kind of work that I'm talking about, which is to say, to make those imaginative leaps out of the specific conditions that are confronting us in Myanmar today, to think with the categories that people are using themselves in those places, but then also to tack into other locations intellectually, and thereby to try and produce something which is innovative theoretically. I don't see much of that happening. So that's precisely why I thought that that was something worth advocating for. Lastly, though, let me say, and this is, as I said already, without any intention of addressing people in Myanmar or presuming that there's anything which I have to say which may be useful or important to them. I do think, to go back to the first question, there really are opportunities for leaders in the NUG and other thinkers in the political community in Myanmar to do this type of work of political theorizing in the vernacular and doing that, having those types of engagement. I think that some of that's going on to the extent I see it online and in other fora, but there are opportunities for more. So that would be sort of the crossover category of audience, if you like, to get then at what's going on in the country itself.
We have a couple of questions online, and we'll get back to the in-person audience. So how important is it for a reconfiguration of state power that the NUG has relatively little de facto power or control of ethnic armies or local PDFs? Does it open up political creativity, or does it more to destabilize?
A short answer to that, do we know the speaker, the questioner's name or not?
Yes, Fallison.
Sorry?
Clay Fallison.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. My short answer would be, why does that have to be an or? And surely the point is precisely that conditions which are destabilizing, conditions of political and social uncertainty, create exactly these kinds of opportunities for engagement and thought. I think that's what I was advocating for. And that's not to say then that we should celebrate or embrace those conditions and say, yay, we need more instability. That's not, again, not at all what I'm saying, but rather that faced with the revolutionary situation, that is the situation in Myanmar today, what kinds of opportunities exist. Now, the question raises a counterfactual, which therefore can't be answered on any empirical or descriptive terms, and that's that, well, what if all of those PDFs, let's just restrict it to the PDFs, because otherwise the answer may be too long. What if all of those PDFs, plural, the Dappoemia, right, rather than the PDF as Dapmador, what if all of them were somehow successfully integrated into a Dapmador-like arrangement? Would that reduce the possibility for these types of engagement and sort of force the types of political responses and action of the sort I'm referring to? Inevitably, yes, from my point of view, as a counterfactual. And the reason is that military hierarchies, as Dapmadors, insist on that. How else do you have those arrangements unless your command structure is such that you diminish the possibility for that type of exchange and resistance? And that's not to say that, of course, there are not military arrangements historically or even in the present where the possibilities of political exchange, dialogue, and disagreement don't exist, especially in political militaries of the sort that in some ways the PDFs are. But any attempt to bring hierarchy of that sort would, I think, inevitably diminish the opportunities for that type of engagement. Having said that, and the one rider and caveat at the end is, well, then what and in some ways it gets back to the questions and discussion we've been having already, what types of, let's say, nascent political theorizing, ground level political theorizing is going on in the PDFs. From what I hear from the limited number of people I know who have access into those organizations, it varies quite considerably. There are some PDFs that are really just, that they're organizing, thinking strategically and literally fighting for their survival. There are others that are engaged in creative programs of political thought and action. And in some cases, it is not surprisingly in places where the PDFs are consolidated to some extent, there is no more civil administration existing from the central state. And actually demands are being placed on them by villagers, by citizens in those places saying that, well, now you are here, so what is it that you're going to do about this or that? Hence the imperative to deal with questions that go beyond those specifically related to the military program and address questions of education, health, social welfare, and so on. And that's the point at which some of these PDFs are on some reports sort of crossing over and becoming, after all, both civil and military administrations, to some extent in the areas that they're occupying. I'm not sure I've addressed the question, but I hope it gets us a bit further along.
So I'll answer one more question online and we'll get back to the in-person audience. So Jacob Miller, so thank you for the presentation. You had mentioned civil disobedience, refusal, and a reformed citizen. Are there any particular thinkers in addition to Brown and Butler, for example, ethicists, who currently inform your understanding of civil disobedience in Myanmar, perhaps in relation to emerging notions of sovereignty or popular sovereignty?
There are lots of names that are bubbling away. I'm not sure how useful it would be to come up with a list. Can I take that message, that question on notice? We'll take another question from the room. I may come back with some citations at the end of the discussion. Otherwise, if that person would be kind enough to give me their email, I'll get back to them. I think when I wrote a first draft of this, I had rather a lot more references to people who were informing my thinking. And of course, in the interests of making it a more engaging and presentation, I removed most of them. But Brown, Butler, these are important people, certainly to the way I'm thinking about it. And Elko Bashi, whose work, let me just say Elko Bashi, whose work I mentioned in the abstract. I would make Elko Bashi's book on Egypt's revolutionary situation, Bread and Freedom, compulsory reading for anyone who's interested in the situation in Myanmar today. And let me, I can't do that, but if I could, I would. That would be my dictatorial intervention. Read Elko Bashi. I think we have one question behind us. Sorry.
I actually have a question that's related to Andrew's question, but so I'm not a political theorist, but as someone who likes theory a lot, I really appreciate your effort at making a case for why theory can help clarifying a really complex situation and helping find grounds, I guess, to act for any stakeholder involved. But I would actually ask in reverse, like for people who are specialists in political theory, I'm sure for them it's obvious, but I'm just asking as a non-specialist, what does this Myanmar case, like what is it a unique case of, like how does it help advance political theory? And I have like a second question, if I may, like it's a much more factual one. You reference in your introduction and in your conclusion, and just right now, like you mentioned like other uprisings, social movements, like so I think of the Arab Springs, for example, which in my understanding kind of revealed the importance of social media in the formation of social movements. And I'm wondering if any of this happened in Myanmar, like what social media, what role did it play? I know for a fact that one of the first measures taken by the military government were like very severe restrictions on access to the internet. So I'm wondering like how did social media play out in the very beginnings of the movement? Sorry, two questions, maybe.
Thank you very much. The second question is a tremendous one, but I'm possibly the worst person doing anything on or in relation to them to ask it to. And that's because I don't have any platform media presence, and nor do I spend time on these platforms. I communicate with colleagues and sometimes look at things about what's going on there. They don't have at all a strong sense of how that engagement was important or why. It's evidence that it mattered to the modes of communication, and also getting again to the theme of this series, that there were semiotic moves, there was the adoption of symbols and other types of interventions, especially in the early days, weeks and months after the coup, that were referential to other struggles around the world, and in particular in the region. Most obviously the three-fingered salute, derivative, I gather, from the Hunger Games, if I'm wrong. But what I know it from, of course, is from Thailand, right? Where, of course, the three-fingered salute preceded its use in Myanmar. And it may have been that again, people in Thailand adopted it from somewhere else, although they're avid television watchers. So it's also possible that it came straight from popular media. So manifestly, there are ways of acting and communicating in the days, weeks, and months after the coup that were greatly influenced by the part that these platforms played. And of course, many colleagues and scholars have documented and written about the incredible growth of Facebook and use of Facebook across all of Myanmar in the 2010s, and the part that Facebook played, as we all know, also in the communal violence in the 2012-2013 period. And many of you will know, and perhaps some of you have been involved in projects in the mid-2010s that were designed to try and do algorithmic interventions and other types of actions. So thank you for the question, and I apologize. I have to, again, suggest if there's anyone else in the room who would like to take it up, I'd love to hear their views as well. The first question is also a tremendous question that I'm afraid the answer I'm going to give may not be the one that you're hoping for, but for different reasons. And that's that this is exactly, you have uncovered the hidden question that followed the first question that I asked at the start of the talk. And that's exactly what I want to try and think through then precisely. If political theory may be of some use, may serve some purpose for us in thinking productively about conditions in Myanmar today, then what is it about the conditions in Myanmar? A quite remarkable revolutionary situation compared to most others in the world today. Egypt, for instance, Al-Qabashi I was referring to, which was violent in many ways, but not at all in the way that we see in Myanmar. What is it that that situation can do to help us sort of break some of the log jams that we sometimes encounter with exactly the categories and concepts I was referring to? Sovereignty, citizenship, sort of these ideas which have made their way through political theoretic inquiry and discussion for centuries, and therefore sort of accumulates a lot of historical intellectual baggage, if you will. How might it be that interventions on questions of political theory from Myanmar's revolutionary situation could actually disrupt some of that thinking? That's really the question I do want to try and get at. In some ways, it also goes to the question about audience that came up earlier. But unfortunately, it's premature for me to answer it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I am a historian of political thought. I work on legal Islam, so I really appreciate your meetings. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the religious establishment. So you alluded to it in your comments earlier on, but I'm just wondering, does the Sangha is there any theory about thinking coming out from them and trying to participate in this redefining and rethinking of citizenship, with all these ups and downs over the decades, and especially recently?
I might really have to defer to Professor Shobo or other people in the room for whom this is exactly the right question to be asking. And I don't know, if you want to take it or if you've been thinking about precisely this question and generating data that might enable us to offer a good response to it. For my part, I have not, so I can't speak to it in any detail, but I can give a reason as to why I haven't. And I'm sometimes criticized for this, and I recognize the merits of the criticism, but perhaps after a while we all have our own ways of going about doing things, and I've somehow come into mine, and that is that I like to try to work towards the kinds of questions they addressed in this paper through and presentation through observations of the kinds of situations they was referring to, those public assemblies, the formations of different groups like university councils, the energy and PBFs, and sort of see what is thrown up. Now, I haven't seen all that much coming out of, say, the monastic community, other religious communities that distinguishes their interventions in the current situation from those of others. But that may just be because I haven't been looking around hard enough. Had I seen that, I think I would go in that direction and see what more could be learned. I think a really interesting question that I have relates to your own, and this is a genuine question that if someone could address, I'd be really pleased to hear about it. I'm not sure to take the responsibility entirely away from me. But the question I have is, among members of the Tanka, the Sangha, the monastic community, what sort of responses have there been to the taking up of arms by the NUG and its affiliates, right? Again, that bold decision that I referred to a while back. For me, it was very disruptive. It was like really one of the early things that had to make me pause and reevaluate my own position on the struggle and think about my own values, political and personal, right? As someone who sort of like, many people who are involved in the revolutionary situation in Myanmar today would say, I personally would never take up a weapon against somebody else in a political conflict of this sort. And in the past, I might have said also, along with people like, here's a name, a couple of names for the person online whose name I forget, sorry, Elizabeth Fraser and Kimberly Hutchins, who have written very strongly against political violence, saying that political violence is never justified, right? A political theoretic position. I've changed my own position. I've decided that the questions of whether or not it's appropriate for, I don't know, I'm drifting away from your point, but I'll come back to it in a moment. The question of whether or not it's appropriate or suitable or necessary to take up arms is, after all, a contingent one. Right? It's not something which I think your political theoretic approach itself can ever resolve. It's only something that in the context can be properly addressed, which is why I would resist sort of an absolutist position of the sort that Hutchins and Fraser take up. But religious people do have principles that are absolutes, whether they're in the Buddhist community or Christian, Muslim, or of other faiths. And so I think that's why your question is important. What sort of responses do we see coming out of those other faiths that variously enable or discourage responses? Julian, would you like to take this up and do a better job of an excellent question than I have done?
I just wanted to add that monastic consideration of violence is not something new. And that there is, in fact, a long tradition of martial arts that was more or less submerged, but reemerged at other times, and individuals moving from the battlefield to the Sangha and back and forth. So the view that Buddhist monks are categorically opposed to violence, I think is maybe more of a Western perspective than one that's necessarily shared across all domains of the Sangha. And we have to think of the Sangha as not a uniform force, but rather very varied conglomeration or a community. Although in principle, it's supposed to be unified, in practice, I think there is a diversity of opinions. And I think we also need to mention in this regard, Mabata.
Yep.
And the very nationalist and anti-Muslim fervor that was and continues to be fermented under its successor organizations. But I don't want to paint the Sangha with the broad of a brush, because there are monks and monastic communities that actively participate in what Nick might call revolutionary imagination or action, and who stand up against violence, and to have a more inclusive vision of a future Myanmar. So I think that's just all there.
And just to close that point with the two poles, if you like, of these relations and the way that monks have just concentrating on the Buddhist community, although we could speak about other religious traditions, have responded to the revolutionary situation. I was in Thailand in the middle of this year, and I met with monks of exactly that type, right? Monks that were very much enjoined with and participating actively in the program for political resistance and encouraging lay people to continue to fight against the dictatorship. And the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Theta Guru Sial, who of course has been going on jaunts to Russia as part of the Qantas program.
Procurement of arms.
Yeah, so I don't know if he's actually personally involved. Maybe better to leave that point there, but suffice it to say that that's exactly the whole range of possible alternatives being taken. In the 2000s, I met monks who would say that although they went about their activities sort of routinely, as it were, that they carried on resistance from the 1980s and 1990s. That, for instance, if they knew a family was a military family or something, they refused donations. Technically, that's not possible, right? You were supposed to have ubeka, like whoever the donor is, whatever form it takes, you receive it. But they were saying that although in many of their daily affairs, they were continuing to go on things like normal, that they, as far as they were concerned, they were still in a revolutionary mode, right? And so those are the kinds of opportunities that obviously European ethnographers and anthropologists, I think from a political theoretic standpoint, it's sort of one step removed, trying to get a grasp on some of the overall characteristics of the conditions, draw out particularly illuminating instances of things happening that might enable us then to take those kinds of small imaginative leaps that I was referring to.
Are we out of time? Last chance, last call? In that case, I want to thank you. It was a very inspiring and interesting conversation. Thank you for making us a part of it.
Thank you all very much for being here, and look forward to the conversations.
So there is lots of food here. Please don't leave the room without eating. And join us for conversation after the talk.